Well, the book is called Laughing at Myself. Laughing at Myself, My Education in Congress, on the Farm, and at the Movies, from University Press of Kansas. Dan Glickman, it's great to see you again, and thanks for taking a little time to join us on This Week in Agribusiness.
I'm glad to be with you, Max.
You talk in your book, and one way many of us recall your term as Secretary of Agriculture was the fact you had such a great sense of humor, and you could laugh at yourself. And in your book, you say humor was the glue in building bridges, and that you learned that from a guy by the name of Bob Dole. I'm sure it was something you copied from Dole, maybe to some extent, but you had to have that inherent sense of humor already, didn't you?
Well, certainly Dole had this great sense of humor, but most of it came from my parents, my dad and mother, who always kind of led me and my brother and my sister believe that if people liked you, they'd be much more likely to do business with you, and you could help persuade them and lead them into what you wanted to do. And the best way to have that likability was to have a good self-deprecating sense of humor, so you could make fun of yourself and in the process put people at comfort, put people at ease. And I found that to be an attribute that helped me, particularly as I dealt with farm and agricultural issues, because when I started out in this business, I didn't know anything about agriculture. You know, we weren't in the farm business at all, and I had to prove to farmers and people in agribusiness that I knew something about it. So laughing at myself was one of the ways that made them feel like I was interested in what they were doing.
That was an era when it seemed like members of the Republican and Democratic Party could really get together, mend fences if it was necessary, work with each other to accomplish things. You said in your book that the House Agriculture Committee was the most bipartisan on the Hill. You think that's still the case?
Less so than it was before. It's still pretty bipartisan. Both the Senate and the House Agriculture Committees are pretty bipartisan. They tend to be not terribly ideological. You don't find too many right-wing conservatives or left-wing liberals on the committees. And part of that had to do with the fact that there was a coalition that was built over the years between farm interests and hunger interests. And so you were able to kind of build bridges between urban and rural life. And I'd say it's still there, but it's a little less filled with goodwill today than it was 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. But that's not just on the Ag Committee. That's across the board in Congress. The atmosphere is more toxic than it used to be. And so one of the points in my book is that humor, self-deprecating humor, is an important ingredient in building bridges and trying to reduce the toxicity in American politics. And you mentioned Bob Dole or Pat Roberts, and there were a few people who had great senses of humor in Congress. But by and large, when you look at our government today in Congress or the White House, you don't really see humor coming out. And I'm not expecting people to be Johnny Carson or comedians on TV, but you don't see that self-deprecating humor that you might have seen during the time of John Kennedy or Ronald Reagan or FDR. Of course, I always talk about Abraham Lincoln, who did serve before me, by the way, in case anybody wants to know.
You haven't been around that long, you're saying. In your book, you say, after Jimmy Carter's grain embargo against the old Soviet Union, as you phrased it, the Democratic Party neglected rural America, and I think you said until very recently. Do you think the Democratic Party is not neglecting rural America anymore?
Well, I think that what happened is that the Democratic Party, to a large extent, became much more of a coastal party, East Coast and West Coast, and they lost the heartland. Now, not completely, but you look at the states in the heartland, and those states used to have both Democrats and Republicans representing them in Congress, and today it's almost all Republican in that part of the country. And I'm not sure exactly what happened. But back in the days when I was in Congress, there was much more bipartisanship and much less ideology. And I'm not exactly sure why it happened. I think but I do think that in recent years, the last few years, there's been an attempt to try to come back together. I know that Senator Debbie Stabenow, who's chairman of the Senate Agriculture Committee from Michigan is very much focused on trying to build those coalitions that didn't exist in earlier days. And she and Pat Roberts, he was chairman, and then she was chairman, and they kind of rotated the chairmanships of the committee. They did a lot to kind of restore that bipartisanship, which we so desperately need.
I would hope young people would pick up your book and read it because I think there's quite a bit of inspiration in there. You talked about arriving in Washington, D.C. as a young man, and I think the words you used were perseverance and tenacity. And you were willing to jump right in there. You worked Saturdays, you were opening the mail, but you took the job seriously.
Yeah, well, I've had a lot of different jobs. Some people say I have trouble keeping jobs, which is probably true. But my favorite job of all was being the congressman, because you actually had this personal relationship with people back home, and you were actually working on problems. They didn't really care if you were liberal or conservative. If they had a problem with Medicare or farm programs or Social Security, they expected you to work on it. And the book does talk about how I used to come in the office on Saturday and open all the mail myself. Drove my staff crazy because I would separate the envelopes from the mail, so sometimes they couldn't find the return address. But I did that because it was my way of trying to really figure out, when you read that mail right when it came in, it really hit you as to what the problems were going on. And of course, today, most of the mail is electronic or digital. And I think it's a lot harder to figure out what people are thinking about in this era.
But among those early jobs you had, as I recall, was operating the auto pen for a lawmaker to make sure that that signature was stamped on there. Again, somebody had to do it, and you handled the task.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, this was for the senator from Colorado, a lot of people thought that he had actually signed all those letters. They didn't know that I used to put the letter in, the signature would go on, and the letter would go out. But it also, that gave me an idea of again, what was on people's minds. And I'm not sure where that came from. I think part of it came from my dad's business. He was in the scrap iron business and the oil business, and we owned the local baseball team, the AAA baseball team. And I used to work down at his place, and sometimes times weren't so good, and so one of the things he cared about was the mail, because in the mail often came the checks. So he used to look for those checks, and I guess to me the mail that came in was almost like looking for those checks back in the old days.
I still look forward to the mail. That's how old-fashioned I am, even though it doesn't hold much for me anymore.
No, 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 you tend to get much more on email than you get on snail mail, as we'd say.
You have spoken often during your news conferences and your speeches and in your book about your wife of 54 years. You've had a good trip together, haven't you?
Well, I've been married a long time, and she's had to put up with me. And I think part of the fact is she's very creative and imaginative. And so, when you have struggles, everybody has ups and downs in life. And she's an optimist. And whenever I'd hit a brick wall, she said, "You got to find a way to get around that wall. You just can't keep pushing your head against the wall." So I've won elections and lost elections, and everybody has had, what I find in life is there is nobody with total upwards trajectory, no matter what they do. You're always going to fall, come back up, and do that kind of thing. So it's going to be 55 years in August, which is a long time, certainly.
God bless. Some of us who have been ridiculed for how we proposed to our wife back in the day have to make note of how this lady was in the hospital bed and she was on her back. There was no chance for her to fight back, and you proposed.
Well, she had, as I recall, she had hepatitis and mononucleosis, which was a kind of common disease of college students who didn't get enough sleep. And so I used to drive from Ann Arbor to Detroit every day. I drove every day about 50 miles each way. And I think she accepted my invitation because she was the only way to get out of the hospital.
You say in your book you were among the most assaulted cabinet members in U.S. history. I remember the pie throwing episode, but share that with folks.
Well, I spoke at a national nutrition summit, and these were people, dietitians and nutritionists and some farm interests, and they were interested in good diets. And so all of a sudden I'm up there, and a woman starts running up on the stage, and I had some security there, not a lot, and she had a pie. And she says, "Glickman, you're nothing but a pimp for the meat industry." and it was a tofu cream pie. So not made with any meat, made, I guess, with soybeans, whatever you make tofu cream pies out of. So she threw the pie at me. I deftly ducked. It hit Donna Shalala, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, on the shoulder. Bob Dole was there at the same time. I don't think he got any of the pie, but I looked at Dole right afterwards. I said, Bob, I don't think we're in Kansas any longer. And but I was also assaulted with infected buffalo guts at Yellowstone Park. I had naked protesters throwing genetically modified seeds at me at a Rome World Food Summit. So whatever reason, I learned very quickly that people care a lot about food, sometimes too much.
You also, on that point, you write in the book about food policy is too important to be left in the hands of farmers alone. And I think this is a little bit troubling sometimes to farmers to think that, all right, here are a lot of people that don't know my business that want to have their hands in it. And increasingly, the writing of the farm bills is getting broader, it appears, and less agriculture oriented. Share your thoughts on that.
Well, I think farmers and ranchers are still the most important part of food policy, but consumers, somebody asked me a few years ago who was the most important force in agriculture today, and I said Walmart, because they sell over 20% of the food. They were the largest food retailer, but you talk about retailers, you talk about processors. And then in the export markets, you got so many people involved in the sale of agriculture commodities overseas. So there's just a lot of people involved in this. And then you have the hunger programs, and they're very much a part of farm programs. And so agriculture is responsible for like 11 or 12 or 13% of our GNP. And there's just an awful lot of people who care about it. And more and more today than there was maybe 30 or 40 years ago. Back when I first got into Congress, the only people who joined the agriculture committees were people from rural areas. I turned out I was the most urban member of the agriculture committee at the time I joined the committee. Well, there was one other member who actually was from Brooklyn. I shouldn't say that, but I was close to it. And now the committees are much more diverse. And I think that's a good thing for agriculture.
When you left the U.S. Department of Agriculture and became the chairman of the Motion Picture Association, I think many people were saying, he's going to do what? It couldn't have been more different, many of us thought, than your career in agriculture and as a lawmaker. Turned out it was a pretty good fit, I think, from what we hear. What do you think of that Hollywood crowd today? With that experience in your rearview mirror, the much maligned Hollywood bunch, especially by those who maybe are a little more conservative. What do you think about Hollywood?
Well, first of all, people think, well, Angelina Jolie must have called me every night asking me for advice. I didn't meet her once. Most of what I was doing was working for the heads of the studios or the lobbying intellectual property rights and export issues. And actually, there was a lot in common with agriculture and the movies, because they're both huge export items for America. And so we tended to work together on a lot of those things to open markets. But, look, it was a different place. I told people that they said, well, what were your credentials for the job? And I said, well, I used to grow popcorn and then I sold popcorn, and it's supposed to get a big laugh. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But it was an interesting period of times, about 7 years in that particular job. But as I look back at my whole career, I would say that I enjoyed being in Congress and at USDA even more. I like them. I love the movie industry. My son's in the movie industry. We'd go to movies all the time, but it was a job that I had to deal with a lot of people with very big egos, much bigger than mine. And so it sometimes wasn't the easiest thing in the world.
Dan Glickman, what a treat to visit with you again, sir. We appreciate it. It's great to see you're doing so well. Laughing at Myself is the book from the University Press of Kansas. We've enjoyed it. We highly recommend it.
Thank you, Max. I look forward to watching you on TV as well.